back to Pod Jam. I hope everyone refreshed their snacks and their water or whatever beverage you're drinking during the break. We are here with a panel, well, an interview with interviewers about interviewing. So we're getting a little bit meta here at Pod Jam. But before we get to those questions, I would like to remind folks that we are fundraising for the Trevor Project, supporting LGBTQ plus youth through the amazing life-saving work that we do. Last panel, we broke the $1,000 mark. I would love to see us break 1,100, maybe even meet that 1,200 goal. If you learn something, if you take a note down, if you feel an emotion during this panel, consider donating $5 to the Trevor Project. Mods will be posting the link throughout the panel. And also, I want to remind folks that there is a giveaway this panel and every panel this weekend. The McElroys have donated their guidebook to podcasting. Everybody has a podcast except you. So if you'd love to read those wisdoms, go ahead and follow the instructions that the mods are posting in the chat to enter that giveaway. But enough housekeeping. Let's start this like triple layer inception of interviews. We'll start off with some introductions. Folks, tell me a little bit about yourself, your podcast, and how interview plays a role in that. And we will start off, we'll go zigzag down the screen. So we'll start with Dr. Moya.
Hi, I'm Moya McTeer. It's technically Dr. Moya McTeer. I'm an astrophysicist, I'm a folklorist, and I'm a science communicator. So I want to bring all of those things together in my podcast, which is called Exolore. It's all about fictional world building. So we build out fictional worlds, but we base it all in fact, which is where the science comes in. And we approach it from different angles. Sometimes we build our own worlds from scratch with a panel of expert guests. I say we, but it's me. And sometimes I analyze other worlds that already exist. And other times I interview world builders to learn and steal their little tricks of the trade. And I didn't think about it as interviewing at first. I thought, oh, I'm just talking to people. And then I realized this is what an interview is. So that's how it plays
Talking to people, yeah. Daniel, what about you?
Hey, yeah, I'm Daniel Kwan. Not a doctor, but a former academic. So I host the Asians Represent podcast. We're a Gold Emmy-winning TTRPG podcast that looks at Asian representation in tabletop gaming media and pop culture. We do a mix of interview content that's live streamed, as well as sort of live reads and critiques of established worlds from a more contemporary perspective. Drawing in academics, game designers, writers to review like old sort of legacy products to kind of provide people with guidelines on how to produce better Asian sort of narrative worlds. So very similar, except from an archaeology perspective.
And Jasper, what about you?
I'm neither a doctor or an academic, but I am an actor by trade, and I guess now a producer. And I do Three Black Halflings. This a show which is talking about diversity and inclusion in pop culture, D&D, from a perspective of three Black people and our kind of experiences in the TTRPG community and how we can kind of, improve the space and make it more inclusive. And yes, we have lots of guests on, and I actually don't think I thought of it as interviewing until I got the email to be on this panel, and I was like, oh, I am definitely interviewing people. That is what I do.
That's so interesting.
How long have both of your podcasts been on? Because mine is about a year old, so pretty young.
3 years, but I've been podcasting for 5 years.
Nice. I'm also, but just over a year now. We've been going about a year and a month, I think, for us.
Meanwhile, I forgot to introduce my own podcast. Doing a great job promoting Behold Her at PodJam. But I host Behold Her podcast, which is all about highlighting stories from femmes, specifically in tabletop role-playing games. Each episode has 2 interviews and then also an audio story from someone either related to the theme of that episode or about the theme of that episode. And I come from a journalism background, so I was very aware, like, I want to do an interview podcast. Interviews are what I enjoy. But I find it very interesting that folks do interview podcasts without realizing they do interview podcasts. That tickles me. I just want to call out a really sweet comment in the chat. Staff of Sage says they just subbed to Exo Lore, and I'm stoked to listen to the Magic Systems episode, which I feel like, yeah, we have a lot of folks coming into this through tabletop related podcasts and interests, and I feel like that one, all of those episodes I think overlap, but that one particularly would be of interest. Okay, so the reason I was so excited to gather some interviewers is I feel like everyone always has a different interview style, whether they realize they do or not. And I want to get super geeky about our interview styles. So let's start off with, how would you describe your style? And whoever wants to jump in first, ready to answer, do a little finger raise. That's my system. Oh, okay.
I think we did that at the same time.
Yeah.
It's very close.
I saw Jasper
go.
first.
Jasper, you go.
Okay. Yeah, I think I think I wanted to go first because I think mine's gonna be the loosest structure, I imagine. But I think it's for me the whole thing of Three Black Halflings in our show is it was going to be very conversational. We wanted the whole field to be very relaxed, very like comedy and fun, or like kind of oriented, and for it to, because we get into kind of heavy topics at times, and it was kind of born out of the whole Black Lives Matter movement that happened last year. It was really important for us that it didn't feel like heady and heavy, and so I think that's how I've always then approached doing interviews with people. It's been about like, hey, I want to us to be like, just literally like throw the tennis ball backwards and forwards, and like and I want you to run over here and take it from me, and then I might run over and take it from you. And I think that's kind of how I imagine it. It's almost like we're playing a little game of tag or something, where it's like we just want to riff and like always make sure there's space for the other person to jump in, but like at the same time, like, you know, take the floor and let's see if we can kind of bounce off one another. So I definitely feel like I have a very chaotic brand of interviewing, because we usually struggle to get through all of the questions, and like we don't have that kind of beat by beat thing, which I know other shows do, and I'm very jealous of them doing it, but I've tried a few times and it just never works because I get way too excited and just I jump in with something. So yeah, I'd say pretty chaotic, but hopefully very fun and conversational. And it's about and I've been very blessed in this. A lot of the guests we have on the show tend to be, you know, from a similar kind of area and things, and so they kind of bounce quite naturally off of you. It'd be interesting to see if I was to interview like more academics or something who aren't maybe used to talking as much as I am or as much as my guests are. So that's my next level, I think, for me to level up, you know.
What about you, Daniel?
I love how, Jasper, I love how you said like, oh, you know, like I don't get through all of the questions. And in my head, I was like, but I thought the opposite. I was like, well, maybe you just get through the questions that are important to the guest, or the questions that matter for this episode, right?
Yeah.
Sure. So I think we both raised our finger at the exact same time, because I think we have very similar styles. Like I have an education background, but you know, like, and I'm sure like Moya, you might agree with me. Some people don't like being talked at.
Yeah.
Like you like to talk with someone. And I mean, Jasper, your style sounds like you lend yourself more to like the, you know, I want to have an authentic conversation with someone, because an authentic conversation is what sort of draws out emotion and draws out the things that, you know, aren't obvious. So I'm the same. I love having that casual conversation. I do a lot of prep. But I always do a lot of prep very much in the same way that a GM does a lot of prep for a TTRPG session. You can prepare for a whole bunch of things, but ultimately, you know, you and your guest or guests are steering the conversation in an interesting direction that you can't anticipate. So for me, especially with TTRPGs, having a casual conversation and anticipating a casual conversation is the style that I prefer, because I feel like it's the most adaptable to all the different personalities that you might have on your show.
And if I can as well, I think that you've hit the nail on the head, because for me, when you're like, much like when you're DMing, when you are like flexible in the moment and something happens that you weren't expecting, like your guest brings up a topic and you're like, oh, that's like, I want to talk about that. That's amazing. But that wasn't on the list of questions. Like then being able to riff on that, for me, like that then becomes almost like a collaborative process, which is always more interesting to me than me just talking or telling you what I want to know. Like you actually bringing something to the table which maybe you haven't had a chance to talk about elsewhere, because there is a slightly more structured kind of interviewing process, etc., is like gold. Do you know what I mean? I'm like,
if an interviewer says what you just said and was like, "Oh, that's interesting, but I've got this question. Let's do this question." I'm immediately turning it off. I'm like,
yeah. That's so true. That's so true.
What about you, Moya? Like, because like your reactions are like, yeah, you know, like you're just.
Yeah, I really relate to a lot of what you're saying. I try to keep everything super conversational, but at the same time, I want it to be an educational experience. So I approach it with I try curiosity and excitement, because I want to learn and I want to build something really cool together. And that's hard sometimes to mesh with a conversational, go with the flow type of style. So I do a lot of preparation. I come up with questions, I come up with alternate questions because we're building a world together. So sometimes I'm like, oh, if they take this direction after I ask this question, then I have to ask this next question. But if they take another direction, I'll go in a different, so I do all of that prep. Usually it doesn't end up happening that way. So a lot of the prep isn't wasted. It's useful still. But yeah, I think maintaining a conversational tone is really helpful for a lot of the reasons you said. Like it makes people more comfortable, especially if you're dealing with academics or people who are new to podcasting.
Yeah, I guess like for you, like there's the added layer. If you're building something during the recording, in addition to collecting information, you're applying that information as well.
Exactly.
It's like application, you have to plan for application.
Yeah, and I really just want to make sure that everyone understands everything that's happening in the podcast. And when I have a biologist on the show who's talking about the nitty-gritty details about how DNA works, I want to then have it make sense why we're applying it to the world in the way that we are. So I do a lot of explaining after I ask questions, and usually I wouldn't recommend that, like explaining what your person just said, but in a science communication context, I think it makes sense. Otherwise, your audience who isn't full of academic biologists probably won't get as much out of it.
So would you say that like your style is very much born out of your academic background and that understanding that academic jargon is a giant turnoff to a lot of people?
100%. Yeah. I try to break down every piece of jargon, but I don't want to avoid jargon because people are going to use it. And I want people to be able to hear that and recognize it in the context. So say jargon and then explain what it means is my MO.
I think it's such an interesting skill, which I think you really hone as an interviewer, which is like latching onto those tiny little details. Like, you know, because a lot of the time, I don't know if you two do this as well, or you three do this, but like when you when someone could be talking for like 5 minutes and right in like the 2-minute mark, someone says something, you're like, okay, I need to keep that in my mind so that I can then reference back to that later. We can dig into that a little bit more. And I can't even imagine how that must be for you, Moya, just to be like, you know, to then be picking apart like actual scientific facts, like on the fly and things like that. I think that's really awesome. Like I aspire to such levels of interviewing. That's very cool.
Thank you. I think it's also really important for us to know that you're going to miss a lot of stuff when you're interviewing, and someone says something in minute 2 and minute 3 and minute 4 and 5 that's all so exciting and you want to touch on all of it. So just being able to accept that you're not going to be able to hit everything is, I think, really valuable for an interviewer.
Also a perfect reason to have a second interview, a follow-up.
Yes.
I know when I'm taking interviews, I always have a piece of notepaper there. It's really important to me that I'm focusing on the conversation, not just my list of questions, but I want to be able to say, like, jot down a word that will remind me of something amazing they said, so that when they finish saying that, I can always go back to that little nugget and pick that apart. It seems like everyone here I won't speak for every interviewer in the world, but all three of you, and myself included, share sort of goals of we want that conversational feel to an interview. Would you say that, how do I want to word this? Would you say that curating that feel is something that came very naturally to you? Is this something where you had to like try out different interview techniques? Take us from baby interviewer to where you are now.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Jasper.
No, you please, you go first.
That made me think about the first podcast I ever recorded. It was so bad. It was so bad. I was sitting here with my friend and thought the topic was really interesting, and we were so excited to do it that we were sitting in my car later that day, and we listened to our own the thing we just recorded in my car. But for me, in terms of my interview style, I think like it in part comes from like playing TTRPGs for like over 2 decades. Like I grew up playing D&D and I really like to talk. But I think it also came from like 8 years of being in grad school. Like 8 years. Yeah, like yeah. Yeah.
Moya felt that. Moya felt that.
Right? That's like right here. It's like a 2-year master's and like 6-year PhD. Like I'm like, but that at the same time, it's like, in academia, one of the things you do is you go to like a conference. And I don't know if this is because you're in more of like, I guess what like people might call the hard sciences, and I came from like archaeology. And you go to a conference and people read off of like a paper, or people stand in front of like their poster and they'll do their presentation, but they're speaking to their peers and they're speaking to people who already kind of have an understanding of what they're doing. Likewise, if you're at like an academic conference, or at least in my experiences, you're speaking to maybe 20 people. Like if you get a lot of people say, oh, that's awesome. But when it comes to doing a podcast and you don't know who your audience is and you don't have an understanding of, their level, and you don't want to make that assumption, like not everyone has like a PhD, or not everyone, went to university, right? Because education is a privilege, right? So I think, boy, like your biggest challenge is obviously like speaking to that and speaking to a broad audience, but also without being condescending, right? While handling jargon. Like you have to balance being respectful and educational at the same time. So for me, it comes from like, like I spent a ton of time in grad school. I had a whole other career in the museum industry as an educator doing science communication. And like, that's where I got my skills. And then on top of that, the being reflexive is a skill that I got from playing D&D, right? And being that forever GM.
Yeah.
I just want to, sorry. Well, just to, with what Daniel ended with there reminded me, I loved in your first answer how you described prepping for an interview as anticipating a casual conversation, very much like preparing as a game master. But I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Moya.
No, I was just gonna jump off and say that for me, interviewing, even though I didn't think of it as interviewing at the time, felt natural because I've always hated talking more than I hate listening. I would much rather listen to a person, especially if I'm talking about myself. So in an interview, I just act the same way that I do in my everyday conversations. End of sentence.
You be your most like authentic self, and the people who like you will tune in for that.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think for me, where I think the whole thing of me not really realizing I was doing interviews until I got invited to do this interviewing panel was the fact that I've always been obsessed with conversation. I think like I can't think of a time, like as soon as I could speak, I remember my mum just being like, you just didn't shut up. But it wasn't that I was just like talking. I was always asking questions. I was always like constantly trying to, and it wasn't even like I had a thirst for knowledge or, because I was never particularly academic or clever. It wasn't like I was always trying to learn new things. I just loved having that human interaction and riffing off of people. And I think that for me, what then happened was when I first started doing this, again, I had a very visceral reaction thinking back to my first interview that I did on Three Black Halflings, and I'm like, oh, it's horrible. Mostly just because, I wouldn't shut up. I'd be like, I'd ask the question, but then keep talking about it. And, explaining the question in case my interviewer somehow didn't understand what I was asking them. So I think that my evolution has just been like, okay, let's get more succinct with these questions And when you're coming up with a question, let's become more succinct and let's get to a point where you can kind of riff backwards and forwards, and I can throw a question out really quickly and then it's done. Instead of kind of me, rambling on for however long. And so I think it's an interesting one, because I think I've come from it from a very just like a genuine love of meeting people, like meeting new people. I get so excited when I get the opportunity to talk to new people and find out about them and ask them questions and stuff. And so I think a lot of it is driven by that. And I think I'm just sort of slightly lucky in that my acting training and things like that teaches me what, Daniel was talking about, being kind of flexible, and then generally just having a slightly obsessive mentality where I want to know everything about everything, then helps when it comes to, oh, okay, we're going to talk about this particular subject today. Great. And I'll just obsess over it for the next 2 weeks until the interview, so that when we come to the interview, I'm like, okay, I'm super ready. What questions? Let's go. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, I think that would be what I say. What about you, Lysa? I'm interested where you're coming at this from.
Yeah, I mean, I think I share a lot of actually where Moya comes from, where I'm extremely introverted. Even when I was starting out my career in journalism, I started out terrified of interviewing people, and I was very I have my reporter's notepad that has all of my questions listed out, and I'm just going to read exactly this list of questions. And that adaptability and flexibility in the interview that we've talked about at the beginning, about fostering more of a conversation, or someone bringing up a little nugget that you weren't planning to ask about, which is actually the interesting thing, that came with a lot of practice. But it was just coming from a place of, I want to hear lots of interesting things that people say, and I don't want to hear myself talk, but I can ask questions about it. And I think it reminds me a lot of what you brought up, Jasper, just having a genuine curiosity or enthusiasm for conversation, or hearing what others have to say about a topic, are really key, I think, to being a genuine interviewer.
Otherwise, why have the other person there?
Yeah, you can have a commentary podcast.
It's being disrespectful.
Yeah.
And I think as well, I think one thing that kind of spurs me on a little bit when I'm in an interview is I really enjoy being put, for me, I enjoy being put on the spot and challenging my own critical thinking, so I really enjoy when an interviewer asks we get onto a topic where I wasn't anticipating, and having to be oh, okay, what do I think about this, or what is my opinion of this? I think that is, for me, one of the most exhilarating parts of a conversation. And when I listen to others having those conversations, I'm oh, it's so exciting when people are when you get in someone, you're oh, actually, I've never really put that together. Let me process this on the fly with you right now. And I think that for both myself and the guest, I think if we can get to that place, then that's probably going to be something that people want to listen to, or people want to consume, as in terms of actually putting it out, right, in terms of putting out this interesting interview, because that's likely to be a conversation that's never then been had before. If you can put your guest, as long as they're at ease to do that, etc., and also yourself, into a point where you're both kind of riffing and coming up with things and talking about things from a slightly different perspective than maybe you'd thought about before, I think that's a real golden ratio moment, So yeah, big fan of that.
Nice.
We've touched on this a little bit already in little bits of our answers here, but I'm wondering if we can shift to what are mistakes that interviewers might make, or another way to put this is, do you have any pet peeves when you listen to other interviews or even your past interviews?
I think we mentioned one already. It's when somebody mentions, Jasper, when you mentioned it, when somebody mentions something cool, and then the interviewer's oh, that's awesome, and it goes to the next question on their list, and I'm just no.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
It's heartbreaking, because you're well, now I feel like I'm being left hanging, and I'm sure right. For me, it's always avoid the low hanging fruit. Ask questions. I hate it when I'm watching an interview and they ask questions that are very obvious. That's the most obvious question. Or somebody will start I'm a big fan of mixed martial arts, and I love watching that, and I love consuming media about that. And we watch these sort of the post-fight press conference, And you could tell that there are levels to the different journalists there. And you can see that based on the response that the fighter or whoever kind of gives. And you get an interview where it's like, yeah, so that fight was kind of boring. What did you think? Like, what? Like,
What
so
are they
like,
supposed to do with that?
what are they supposed to do with that?
Like, how are they supposed to answer that's going to be in any way
Exactly.
interesting?
It's like asking that same question that everyone else asks just to have the answer on your show is not the thing to do. It's not the thing to do. You want something different. Ask something that isn't obvious, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, that would be my one big one.
I think if I just to jump on the back of that, something that I've started doing is like I might have like the same question, but I might have like a few levels depending on like where I feel like we're at in the interview. Like if I feel like they seem really relaxed and chatty, then I might go like a little deeper and ask a slightly more complex question. But if we're like, we're at a light place and it's going okay, then I might ask something that's a bit more general. But generally, one of my big pet peeves, which is why I do that specifically, is because I really don't like general questions. Are just like, well, this is, if you give them a loose question, they'll give you a loose answer, and that's just not going to be, it's not going to be enjoyable, right? Like, it's really nice when. I always love that moment when they're like, oh, that's a good question. Because I think that if you can challenge them to actually think during this, then that's going to be so much better for them than, and like more exciting for them as an interviewee as well, if they actually got something then to do, Whereas if you ask them like, oh, how did the fight go? Well, you saw the fight. You all know how the fight went. Yeah,
I lost.
Exactly. I lost, dude. Like, come on. What do you want me to say? It's so boring and repetitive, and I'm so there with you. Because sports interviews are often like the worst. It's just like, yeah, so it was good, and I could have done that better, but at the end of the day, we got the win. It's just like,
I mean, what was a great? I mean, I'm sure that people watching might be like, okay, what's an example of this? Like a big one in TTRPGs is like, what do you love most about D&D? Like, what do you love most about this game? How can you make that question better? Like, I would love to know from you two. Like, what would you do to kind of make that question a little different?
That specific.
It's like, I like rolling dice, right? Like, what would you do differently?
Yeah.
Like for me, I might be like, okay, well, like Moya, do you play? You do a lot of world building, right?
I do. I have played D&D. Yeah.
And you play D&D. So like for me, I would go and ask like, well, like obviously you have a background in like a scientific background that is beyond my scope of understanding. I personally would love to know how you apply that to your games, or even if you do at all.
And that's an exciting question. I want
that's
to
what I would
answer
do.
and talk about it. Yeah.
Right. Because I want to know more about what like you and what you do and what that looks like in your like life. How do you apply your, your academic background to everything else around you? Like that's fascinating.
Yeah. And those are the types of questions you can only ask if you've researched the person you're interviewing enough to know their background and how their background will intersect interestingly with the topic of the interview.
So would your answer be for a pet peeve be somebody be like, who doesn't do research?
Yeah. Typical academic response. But yeah, I think that you should do research. And I think it does tie in with what you were saying earlier, Daniel, about just asking a general question or asking the same question. Because especially if you're interviewing someone who has done a lot of interviews, I don't think you should ask something that they've already answered in public before. So I think doing your research will help you figure out what interesting questions you can ask because you know what's been asked before and you can build off of that.
Yeah, I completely agree.
My peeve, and I would actually really love the group's help unpacking this, is that it really bothers me. So we talked about how we like interviews to feel like a conversation, and yet it really bothers me when the interviewer is talking way too much, or like they let the person answer and then there's like 10 minutes of them responding to the person's answer before the next question. Why is that different from a conversation?
Well, in a conversation where you're just talking to a person with no goal in mind, there's not an imbalance or there's not a reason for the focus to be on one person. But in an interview where you have invited this person on to talk about their expertise, to give their own little unique twist on something, you want to hear that. Like that's why you invited them on. So I think that, yeah, it should be most of the time them talking. I do this, I check this for myself by looking at the amount of time in the transcripts that I make for my episodes, how much of the transcript is me versus the guest, and I try to keep me at under like 30%.
Mhm.
That's really
Which you
interesting.
can't really do in real time because the transcript
Yeah.
happens after, but
Yeah.
then you could go back.
You
and
could always look
edit
at
it.
you could always look at the waveform when you're
That too.
recording, depending on the tool that you're using. I think it also depends on, say, like the kind of person, because I know like we're gonna talk a little bit later about people who are shy,
Mhm.
right?
Mm,
And I think there's some give and take there with how much
Very
you speak
true.
and with what you're saying, of course, right?
Oh, please, Jasper.
No, yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, I do agree, because I think that's something that is an interesting challenge when you first meet it, and it can be the case that like when you have someone who is shy, you kind of get like a series of short and great answers, and maybe you can like it's about then you kind of expanding on it, and so like I think that you do have to then just that's when I think you really do have to kind of get the mining gear out and kind of go, okay, in that question we got this, so let's see if we can go further into that and further into that, and so you might end up talking a little bit more, but hopefully it's always with the aim of redirecting that answer, like redirecting your response back to a question for them.
Yeah.
And I think that to go to your to Daniel's earlier point as well, which is that like if you're watching some sort of like a fight or something, like there's a reason why people don't generally tend to sit around and watch like a 2 hour long or whatever it is, like training video with just that one guy in the gym punching a bag. It's just like it's not interesting. So therefore, like you need two people in the fight. You need two people to play the sports game, because if you don't, then realistically what ends up happening is it's just like a training exercise. It's just like, well, I can just if I want to just listen to this guy talk, I'll go and listen to like another show that he does or whatever it is. Like it's really important that you don't drop the ball. Like we had this expression at drama school where we would literally throw a tennis ball backwards and forwards, and it would be like you can't let the ball drop, and when you hold on to the ball too long, the ball drops. Do you know what I mean? So if you try to hog the stage, if you try and be in the spotlight all the time, it's just not entertaining, and the ball drops. The energy seeps out of the whole thing, and you've got to try really hard to then pick it back up. And normally, you need the help of your interviewee to then pick that energy back up. So
Yeah, that's why in like pro sports they have like a color commentator and they have a commentator and they have like maybe a technical commentator, because they aren't actually interviewing someone. They're having a conversation between co-hosts. So it's a podcast that just has hosts and no interviewees, right? Or like other shows, like when I think of like SciComm, I think of like Infinite Monkey Cage is like one that I really enjoy. And I think it's interesting because they have two different personalities who keep things really interesting, keep the energy up, and it's sort of incite emotions from one another. I think is really cool.
I should actually shout out my two other co-hosts of Three Black Halflings as well, because they definitely help a lot in terms of like no, but it's exactly that. Like I think generally I tend to steer the questions, and I tend to kind of riff in kind of finding us a new question or steering the conversation. But like the other two do a great job of like chipping in and helping to keep that kind of ball up in the air, like whilst we're going. So I definitely think that like there is something to that as well. There is something to having like the sort of co-host style where you're allowing a few different people, because then you're going to get different angles, and there's also a chance that there's a time where the person you're interviewing might riff better with someone else, and then you can kind of let them take the lead on this thing.
I've never interviewed with another person. When you do your prep as a co-interviewer, do you do it together?
Yeah.
So I will go through most of the questions and things before we like go into the interview, and I'll always like field it like questions from the other two as well, and then we kind of get to a point where we all feel like, okay, we know the general steerage of this like conversation, we know we want to get, we know we want to end, that kind of thing, and then I think it tends to be like that. Like the other two don't probably feature as much in the interview in like episodes, but that's just because we kind of have like an established style now where it kind of feels very natural. We kind of drop into a bit of a rhythm, which feels quite nice. So yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting process, and one that I enjoy doing. I enjoy not having to take the whole heat myself. It's good. So you're definitely more brave than me, Moya.
Yeah, I do like
collaboration.
I set up like touch points and like questions from audiences and like major takeaways that might be cool to hit, and then resources. A big one for me is research. So like obviously like with an academic background, with that kind of experience, like good at finding information. So what I always do is I collect as much information as I can so that my co-hosts don't have to do that and they could focus on their strengths. So everybody
Good
kind of
one.
plays off of each other.
So Jasper started to unpack this puzzle. So I'm actually going to jump ahead in our list of questions. So let's tackle that. You've got a nervous or shy interviewee. Maybe they've never done a podcast or an interview before. What do you do to open them up? And this can start even before you start recording, maybe? Do you have strategies?
Yeah, I think pre-recorded is very important. One of the big things I make a point of doing is like sending out a very detailed like brief, because I tend to find the more shy interviewees are the ones that read a bit more, like who tend to prepare a little bit more for the interview itself. And so I think it's really important to do that, because then they're like, okay, they then have like most of the questions we were going to ask, or at least they have like a kind of a bit of a blueprint for the interview itself, and they can kind of prep questions, and they can kind of have a bit of an idea as to what things they're willing to share or not willing to share, etc., which I think helps, so they're not having to kind of figure that out mid interview, which for some people can be a little bit daunting. And then, yeah, like once you jump into the Zoom, like if you haven't got like a hard out, like I always try and like make sure there's time for like a little bit of a conversation beforehand, say hello, introductions, all of that kind of stuff. And then I think generally when you get into it, the big thing that's helped me, and I'd be interested to know you three have the same, but like I fell into this totally by accident, which is I found like a really solid opening question, which basically just gets the interviewee to talk about themselves and something they know very, very well, which is for us it's like we always ask like, what's your D&D origin story? So
That's my question.
and yeah, it's great, right? It's such a good question, because it's just like, okay, when did you start playing D&D? And it's like it gives them a platform. It's quite like a general question, but it gives them a platform to go into as much or as little detail as you want. And I find that from that one, I always know the kind of interviewee that I've got on my hands. I'm like, okay, great. We've got a really strong platform here. Let's jump off and, go in whatever direction. Because if they're there for like a solid 10, 15 minutes answering that question, I'm like, oh, sweet, this is going to be easy. You know what I mean? But if it's like, yeah, so I started playing when I was 6 and I really like it.
Oh boy.
Okay. Here we go.
Good game.
Good game. So 6. Why 6? Like, so you start digging into like that stuff. But I'm interested to know if you have the first question thing was huge for me, and that was totally by accident. I discovered that. I was just like, we should just have a slightly uniform approach to interview episodes, and I was like, okay. So that's how it happened. But yeah, what about you guys?
I ask at the beginning of every episode what fictional worlds my guests have been inhabiting lately, which gets them into the mindset of thinking about fictional worlds. And, if they've been reading a book or watching something, it's usually something they're excited about. So they'll talk about it a lot.
I don't have a set question like that. That's a really cool idea. For us, it's a little bit difficult just because we don't have like a central like theme. It's not like world building or this thing. It varies episode to episode. We also do everything live. And we go for 2 hours. So one of the things that I do, especially if someone's shy or nervous, is we make sure that we offload a lot of the technical burden from the guest. A lot of podcasts will go and they'll be like, okay, do you have Audacity? Can you get this installed on your computer? Can you make sure that's recording in this, this, and this? And your guest is like, well, what? And it's trying to get everything set up, and it immediately puts them on guard. So we do our best to make sure that we send out a calendar invite to everyone. And in that calendar invite, it has our consent form, the Zoom link, the Zencastr link. So it's all in one spot, so that when we go live, they're just here for the conversation and everything else is taken care of on our end. One thing that I always do is this kind of combines, goes with the research. And I've actually pulled up some notes I had taken for a recent episode that we did. We talked about the Avatar Legends TTRPG. And it was an interesting one because it was my show, but I'm also on the Avatar Legends design team. So for me, I was always taking that okay, well, I'm going to take a step back and I'm going to highlight everyone else and not me, because this episode is about them and the project and their contributions and not my own. But one thing I always do is I always ask people hey, what have you got going on lately? What are you proud of? And, introduce yourself. because that's the first thing you're going to do on the show is like, who are you? What are you doing? I don't like to do the introductions for the person because I like to hear what they are most proud of and what they're willing to talk about. And in doing that introduction, I'll have of course done my research, and I'll, pull up something from my research that they may have mentioned or alluded to. And in doing so, you basically incite a positive emotional reaction from your interviewee. Because like, yeah, you mentioned that, like, yeah, you're we had someone who was like, a psychology professor, martial artist, and board game designer. And he mentioned that. And I was like, yeah, everyone go follow Senfoong Lim, SenFoonglim on Twitter. And Sen is a psychology prof. And so I was like, okay, you mentioned that. One thing I really want to talk about is, how you incorporate, sociocultural theory of learning into your game design. And we started talking about that. So I love to take that research, and I love to, really do a deep dive and then see if I can apply that to the very first question. And that's the introduction. Who are you and what are you all about and what have you got going on?
I love that. I always end my interviews asking if there's something I didn't ask about that they wanted to talk about, which often ends up becoming like a second interview added on. Asking at the beginning is such a good idea.
Yeah, and it's not even directly asking, what do you want to talk about? Because they've already agreed to be on the show, but it's kind of saying, okay, these are your values. It's assessing what they are hyped about, right? And then going right into that. Because I feel like the key to being a great interviewer is being able to draw emotion out of your guest. Because if you're able to draw emotion out of your guest, well, then, they're already on board. They're already on board. They're already like super into, what you're doing and what you're talking about. And it kind of lifts that anxiety off of the situation. Like, for instance, like, Jasper, I saw for you folks on your podcast, like, you folks talk to like Dom Monahan and Billy Boyd. Right?
Yeah, that was
like that's like as like a Lord of the Rings like nerd, that's like a big interview for me. But if I were prepping for something like that, I wouldn't even talk about Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Like, I want to talk to Dom about Wild Things, that nature show he had. And I want to talk to Billy Boyd about Beefcake, his band. Like, I want to talk about those things because I know that, they don't talk about that all that often. And it's something that they're passionate about.
Yeah, for sure. That was definitely something that came up for us, and it was great. We ended Jeremy was in Cincinnati, and we ended up getting to talk about the cicada. I can't even the cicadas basically come like out of the ground every 12 years, and because obviously Dom has Wild Things, just goes on like a big riff about cicadas and what they are and how they operate and everything. And it was amazing. Like, it was a total. It was something like I'd watched like a ton of the episodes of Wild Things.
They're
and
good.
I brought it up. It's really, really good. I really recommend people watching it. It's great. And and so it was very much in like a, and I think that and I'm interested to know how this goes for you guys, because I find that for me, us having a more casual conversation, like in a very kind of relaxed, like not expecting too much of people, the way that I like to approach the questions is usually like in a slightly humorous way. So we approached like that one in being like, hey, I was watching a clip of you earlier getting bitten by some ridiculously like strong ants or whatever. And, and then it led on to kind of like quite a fun and light kind of conversation. So I tend to find that like writing the actual questions is quite hard for me. I tend to like know the topics and I'll write something to put in the brief, but like that's never how I plan to ask the question. I always like it to come out then of what's happening, and to like go to the thing about keeping people like if someone is shy or whatever. Like, I think that's kind of a good thing, is to not be rigid in your approach to asking the question itself, because if you just, it's like we were saying, if you stop abruptly, or even if the conversation just comes to like a natural end and you're like, so on this day, you said that you immediately like launch into something like that. It can feel a little jarring or a little, so like having like little segues in your head, like even like stock segues are pretty good, because if the conversation does come to an end and you go, oh, that's really interesting that you said that about that. Okay, great. And then you can move on, like always give a little reference point, like a little anchor back into the conversation, and then find a way to try and link it. It's, it's not always easy. And some of the transitions can be a little clunky and rough, but you gotta forgive yourself for those
The
ones.
segue is one of the key skills.
It's
of
tough.
interviewing.
It's tough. The segues are tough.
I think of this in terms of how I learned empathy. You know, when someone comes to you and they are complaining about something, don't immediately start talking about yourself. Always respond to that first. And that's how I try to approach podcasting. Another thing that I've found helps with nervous people, because this is what helped me when I was really nervous starting out doing interviews on the interviewee side, is purely selfishly from the podcaster's perspective. It is in their best interest to make the interviewee sound good. So when I have a really nervous interviewee and I go through all of those other steps, like sending them the questions, trying to have a conversation with them beforehand, but if I feel like I still really need to say something, I'll be like, look, I'm going to make you, like, I'm sure you're going to sound great, but editing exists and I will make you sound good. Like, you're not going to sound like, you know, a fool coming out of this podcast.
Yeah. And just as well, I think that on like that about making them sound good, matching their energy feels really important for me. Like matching, like sometimes we have really like softly spoken and, you know, guests who just, you know, take their time. And for me and for the three Black Halflings, we are three very excitable people. You know what I mean? Like we get hyped. But that could be super overwhelming for some people, you know. And so reading the room is super important. And we always make a point of being like, okay, let's you know, like, let's just be aware of that. Let's try and match that energy. Let's try and see what they bring. And then, you know, when we had like Abria on the show, it was just like pure pandemonium and chaos because that was just absolutely what Abria was there for and what I think people who like Abria were there for. And so it worked. But like, it wouldn't have worked if we'd have applied the same thing to, you know, other people or, you know, even like Dominic Monaghan and Billy Boyd, who had less understanding of like who we were and like our show, it might have been wild if we were just like, who, like, you know what I mean, like going crazy and making jokes left, right, and center, and it just wouldn't have worked. It just wouldn't have worked. So, yeah, it's a balancing act, but I think you're absolutely right, Moira. It's just by getting that like matching their energy and making sure that you're like, yeah, we're going to support you in this. We're here to support you in this moment and on the show.
I think everything folks have brought up already are already great tips for what makes a great interviewer, but I'm going to open this conversation up to just general interview tips, or if there's other podcasts or interviewers, whether they're on a podcast or not, who you admire.
Could I ask a question to the three of you about this?
Absolutely.
Because this is something I struggled with, especially at the beginning, which was like the research that you talk about and kind of what is good and what is not good. And you've spoken at length about doing the research. And I think I've gotten off lightly because most of my guests are like TTRPGs, and so I can literally just go listen to their podcast or something. So it's fine and easy. But like for you, what would you say is what like the key things you've got to like nail down? I know, Moya, you brought up what stuff they have said before, so try and avoid that. So I guess maybe I'll start with like I'll throw over to you, Moya. Like, what is important for you when you do that research?
Well, I spend a lot of time choosing guests, so I do a lot of research in that stage too, and it does depend on what type of episode I'm doing. So for a live group world building episode, I'll try and read maybe some of the papers that the guests have written recently or that they've been on, or some of the conferences that they've presented at, just so that I know what part of their academic discipline is fresh on their mind, and because that's probably going to be what they're most comfortable applying to a new world building activity, which is not something people are very used to doing. If it's a world builder that I'm interviewing to like learn about their skills, say it's an author, I'll read as many of their books as I can before I interview them. And I'll look up their interviews, because if they have published books, then they've gone on book tours. And so it's pretty easy to find interviews that they've done.
Yeah, that's great. What about you, Daniel? I'm interested because you do obviously a bit more TTRPG stuff. So what are the touchstones of that research?
Yeah, I mean, I usually go to their social media. Like that's the first thing I always do, because that's where they're going to be the most active. It's how I learned that you folks did the Dom and Billy interview literally just before I asked the question. I was just like, you know what, this Jasper fellow seems really cool, and this Moya is really cool. Like we're meeting for the first time, and I'm looking you folks up. But this is also like, I have ADHD, so this is something that I kind of do while I'm interviewing. It's how I be reflexive, right? So for me, like I always go to the social media because, I talked about this on the marketing panel for PodJam 2021. Is that also follow Penwood Studio? I one thing I do is that like I like to see what people are putting in their daily story, right? Your Twitter feed, your Instagram story, that is your story, and that is what you're choosing to tell people, and that is clearly what you care about. Same thing with what you retweet or the website that you put on your like Twitter profile or whatever. That's what you care about, and so I always look there first. And then of course some folks have very extensive websites. Like Moya, your website is got an extensive amount of information, and I think it's fascinating, right? So what am I going to, how am I going to selectively pick, what we're going to talk about? Like, if, we're going to talk about, world building, I probably won't bring up like chemokinematics because that's on your website, right? I'm looking at it right now with this like really beautiful animation. But if we're talking about, discovery, I might want to talk about like exotopography. And I'll definitely bring up your research with that and the research paper that you've written on that, finding mountains with molehills. Like I want to talk about that because that incites, an emotional reaction from you. And of course, that's like
immediately smiled.
Yeah, and that's me. That's showing that I'm being, I'm being respectful, and like I genuinely am interested in what you have to say and the value that you bring, especially if someone's nervous. They feel like the big one, and I'm sure, all of us here have had that. And it's like, oh, I don't know why you asked me to be on your podcast. You could have asked a million other people who I think are way better than me, right? And the research is how you can really go into that.
That's a really great point. Yeah, showing them that there is a reason you picked them.
Yeah, they have value. And not just like, oh, you are a valuable commodity to me growing my show. No, you have value in, this conversation, and I would like to learn from you. And this is why I picked you. Not because, people were talking about you online. Like, I want to know more.
Yeah, I think learning from people is something that feels really awesome. You know what I mean? Like going into it and that would be a tip, I guess, for me, would just like try and learn something from your guest. Like try and genuinely see if you can learn something either about them, their life, their story, that what they're really good at, and jam with it. Like it's I think that way you are gonna get to something which is gonna be really valuable, like, and really, really fun for people to listen to.
Yeah. There's another part of that question that you had asked is like, who are you like what was it? Staff of Sage asked, are there interviewers that inspire you or maybe you tried to emulate or learn from? I will say one before, like I would love to know from everyone else, because we all listen to different shows. It's like, who are you hyped about? Like, what do you like? One thing that I think we didn't talk about is being overly agreeable. I mean, I'd love to know, Moya, if this comes up in like a world building sort of conversation. But one thing that really turns me off of a podcast is when the host is obviously like, yes, like saying yes and agreeing to literally every single thing that the guest might say. And I think a great skill is actually being able to respectfully disagree and have that be part of the conversation. I did that yesterday, actually, on PodJam. The Victoria Rogers asked a question during the marketing thing, and I said, I would actually like to reframe that question because I think this question is not the most genuine question, and maybe we could get something more out of it. And then we kind of turned that into a whole 15-minute conversation. But I would love to know, like, what do you folks think about that? Because like in academia, like we see that in the tradition of academia itself, in how knowledge is passed on and how academic institutions perpetuate,
as Jasper
literal traditions.
As Jasper and Moya give that a think, I'll answer.
Yeah.
So I guess Behold Her is a little bit different, where mostly I'm giving a platform for folks to talk about the projects they're excited about. And the tougher cultural things that we pick up are usually, I usually get this to this near the end of the interview because folks have opened up at that point. But I ask, what has your experience been as a femme in tabletop? And honestly, I genuinely am empathize with a lot of like the trickier parts that come up with. So I do think Beholder is probably more of a positive affirming type interview style, but I think that comes with the nature of the topic and also who I am positioned as an interviewer in relation to that topic.
Yeah, I think just to piggyback on that, I think that for us, I think part of it is we definitely, again, a part of doing that research is just like because when we're talking about like race and things like that, like it's a sticky conversation, which like for us it's like we definitely don't want to be surrounded by people that have all the same opinion on these topics, but we want to be surrounded by people who can expand our own like understanding of this thing. And so I think generally when I'm asking questions, I try not to put in binary questions that can have that could then have a binary answer in which we might be like, I disagree with that. It's more like I want you to talk about your experience, and therefore like it would be wrong of me to say your experiences aren't correct, but what I can say is like, oh, that's different to my experience. You know what I mean? So I think that that's kind of the angle maybe that we come out on the show is it's more it's more experience that I guess than maybe Moya's is, where it maybe is at least for you like a slightly more binary yes, no, right, wrong kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. So on the live world building episodes, I try to approach it as improv. We are improvising a new world, and the rule in improv is yes and. So whenever I ask the guests a question, it's like, oh, what types of physical features do we want the life forms on this planet to have? I never want to say that someone's idea is bad. The only time the few times I've pushed back on that have been when it definitely goes directly against the science. One time someone said something about tides, and they then like made a life form based on that. And I was like, actually, that's not how the tides work. I didn't say it quite that way. But then I redirected it. In the episodes where we're analyzing fictional worlds, that is where differences of opinion can come in. And so I will often disagree with some of my guests in those episodes, because when you are experiencing and analyzing a fictional world, you're bringing in your own personal context to that. And so it's okay to disagree.
That's really cool.
And I think just as well, just to finish up on that point, to what you were saying there, Moya, about kind of the way you approach, not like necessarily like correcting something or changing something, but the one thing that I'm very blessed with is that we, with the two other co-hosts, we've gotten very good at like challenging each other on these kinds of things. And so like, we've got an episode coming out this Monday, which is it's like a very race focused episode about the representation of drow within TTRPGs. And for us, that was a very interesting conversation, because there was a lot of stuff we were wrapping our heads around like in the moment, right? Because we were challenging each other and trying to push each other. And so like, I do think that there is definitely a skill in that. But for me, I'm always like, how do I get as close to avoiding that kind of confrontation? How do I phrase it in that way, like you said, Moya, like of not being like, no, that's not how that works. You know what I mean? It's just like, how do I gently push back on this and redirect this thing rather than like push it over? Do you know what I mean? So I think it's an interesting thing. How do you handle that, Daniel? Like, what is it for you that what's the key for you in pushing back or challenging someone's point of view?
I think it's like a combination. I think it's a combination, right? There are times when like, you don't want to disagree because, you're talking about a matter of perspective and lived experience. But if we're doing something where we're like reading a book and we're analyzing a pre-built world and somebody mentions something, I will 100% say like, no, I disagree. And here's why. Because I think education is important, and, conveying, information to your audience is really important. But I think, instead of saying you're wrong, be like, but what about this? And I think using a disagreement to actually create more conversation is what I would do.
Yes, and I think you've kind of, in the example there, you've kind of nailed it, right? Which is like, instead of just giving a hard block, it's being like, it's like a soft block with an alternative, right? Like that's the key to it, I think. Whereas if you just hard go, no, that's not how it works, and then leave it,
like
that feels super confrontational and a bit weird. Like that's just going to create like the wrong kind of environment, I think, for the interview. Whereas if you can be like, yes, okay, not quite where I was thinking, or not, or I don't think that's actually correct, but I think it's more like this. So you're not like if you can find ways to explain how they're not 100% wrong, but maybe like 50% wrong, that also helps to soften the blow a little bit.
Yeah. And I would love to know, like, because I want to make sure we answer Staff of Sage's question. Does everyone have like a favorite interviewer?
Ooh.
Someone in
Because
chat
all of you,
stole
all of
mine.
you, all of you are my favorites, but you know.
Chat brought up Hot Ones, which I guess isn't a podcast. but
Sean
on YouTube-
Evans is a
Sean
fantastic.
So
Evans.
good.
Yeah.
Also a great premise too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's unbelievable that you are literally getting your guests to a point where they are like, especially with celebrities who are like media trained, you are literally getting them to a point where they are going to have to abandon all of that because all they can think about is the fact that they're on fire.
Well,
you
it
know,
makes
like
them
it's so
vulnerable.
good. Yeah, it
Makes
makes
them
it's an
vulnerable.
amazing. You're willingly like making your guests say like, "Hey, be vulnerable," and they're like, "Okay," like it's great.
I hate to cut off this conversation, but we have hit the end of our panel time. So if you do have folks you recommend others check out, we'll bundle that into outros, which we shall do in backwards order. So we're starting with Jasper.
Hey, so shall I
To say all the
plug
things
the
where
stuff?
folks can find you, plug your things.
Sure.
Yeah.
Cool. So yes, you can follow me at JW_Cartwright, or you can follow Three Black Halflings at TB Halflings. We are a talk show podcast that is talks about diversity and inclusion within TTRPG and pop culture from the perspective of three black people from all different corners of the globe. We also do actual play, which we'll be announcing our second season of that actual play very, very soon. So make sure you check out our social medias, potentially even today. I don't know. We're feeling spicy today, so maybe.
Hot ones.
Yeah, exactly. And I would recommend. I really enjoy the David Tennant podcast. I think partly just because he has a really interesting interviewing style where, because he's friends with a lot of these people and has worked with them in like an intimate way, you just get stuff that you don't normally get from those celebrities. Like they get really like in-depth conversations just about what it is to be in the spotlight, etc. They're very relaxed, very chilled. So the David Tennant podcast. David Tennant also has just got a gorgeous and lovely voice. I could listen to that dude all day. So that's what I would say. Thank you.
Great suggestion. I had no idea. Daniel.
Yeah, you could find me on Twitter at Daniel H. Kwan. That's KWAN. You can pretty much find everything that I do from my Twitter page. You can listen to the Asians Represent podcast at AZNS Represent. We talk about Asian representation in tabletop gaming and pop culture. In terms of interviewers, I'm going to go with my whole sports thing. Ariel Helwani hosts a long-form interview show about mixed martial arts called the MMA Hour. Highly recommend.
Ooh, okay.
Very cool. Moya.
Yeah, you can find me at Go Astromo on Twitter and Instagram, although I never use Instagram. And you can find Exolore, it's EXOLORE, wherever you get podcasts, or on Twitter and Instagram, it's Exolore Pod. And I am taking this month off, but I'm in the middle of a really fun series right now where I'm taking 3 episodes to build out a world instead of doing it in one. So I'm doing environment in one episode, then biology, and then culture. And I'm real excited about that trilogy. And I think one of my favorite interviewers is probably Allie Ward of the Ologies podcast. I think she makes me excited about even the most ridiculous little topics. So I love that. And I think Rose Eveleth of the Flash Forward podcast does a good composite interview where she interviews a lot of people for one episode. And then it's interesting to see how it gets stitched together.
Great recommendations. I'm gonna listen to the VOD of this, which will be on YouTube later, so that I can write all of those down. I am Lisa Penrose. You can follow me personally at Lisa Penrose in all of the places. You can check out my podcast, Behold Her podcast, wherever podcasts are free. And Podjam is being presented by Penwitch Studio, which is a network that shines a spotlight on a bunch of fresh voices in the geeky sphere. So give at Penwitch Studio a follow on Twitter as well, if you are so inclined. Thank you everybody who donated during this panel. I know we got a very generous donation from the D&D dad, $100. We are less than $100 away from our next goal, so very excited about that. Stick around because our next panel is Next Steps, how to monetize your podcast. So if you're looking to level up, I will be taking notes during that panel as well. Thanks everybody. See you in 15 minutes.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.